Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Kapman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, CMC, pharmacovigilance, as well as medical writing. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employer recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to thefdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I am speaking with Ashley Preston. Hello, Ashley.
Hello, Nicholas. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining. So before we get into the topic for today, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Ashley Preston, and I currently head regulatory affairs and quality at Blossom Hill Therapeutics. And I come with about a 20-year background, predominantly in regulatory affairs, but also in GXP quality, medical writing, and operational excellence, building small companies.
Okay, beautiful. So with that, what are we talking about today?
I thought today we could talk about one of the key topics in drug development and regulatory affairs is how to prepare and execute a quality regulatory meeting, a meeting with a regulatory agency, for instance, FDA or EMA. How do we go about it? Why do we do it? And how can we do it well?
Right, beautiful. So why is it so important to prepare for meetings with FDA and EMA? What's the importance of these? Let's start at the highest level.
Indeed, indeed. So at the highest level, the drug development spectrum, when you're developing a drug from discovery through to market to your NDA approval, there are different phases of development, of course, phase one, two, three, and the lines blur between them as everybody tries to squeeze development, particularly clinical development, into a very small space to capture as much data as possible in the shortest possible time so we can get those new medicines to patients approved and on the market as soon as possible. And critical there is your ability to deliver the data that regulators need to make decisions about your product. You need that data to demonstrate efficacy, safety, and the quality of your medicine. And FDA and EMA and all global regulators have different guidelines and regulations that they've published, which tell you what their expectations are for that data. And so your meeting with the regulators such as FDA during your pathway of development is critical to make sure that the development path and the particularly the clinical trials you're designing for your program are going to meet those needs and to get alignment and advice from the agencies along the way to make sure that what you're designing is going to deliver the data they need to be able to ultimately approve your products.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. So you mentioned FDA and EMA. Are they different in how they handle these meetings? And if so, what is the difference?
Sure, they are structurally different in the way they handle these meetings. FDA and EMA are what we can consider the first tier, if you like, of regulatory agencies. They have the greatest resources available to them, and most companies will pursue engagements with FDA and or EMA during their development cycle to make sure that they can deliver the data that those agencies need to ultimately approve the product. FDA has a more developed process in the sense that there are different types of meetings you can request with FDA. They have milestone meetings during development that they expect you to have with them. So, for instance, an end of phase one, an end of phase two meeting. You can also have a pre-IND meeting before you submit your IND for clinical trials, and you would have a pre-NDA meeting to meet with them to discuss what your NDA is going to look like. In between, they also have Type C meetings, which are available to sponsors to discuss any type of topic on development, be it clinical, non-clinical, CMC, and you can discuss with the FDA at any time. You request the meeting, you file your briefing book, and they will schedule a meeting with you to discuss any issues you're having and any questions or alignment you need to get with the agency to make sure you can move your program forward. And in the last PDUFA, FDA introduced a new type of meeting called Type D. And that came about because industry needed a mechanism by which they could access in a very short time frame, quick meetings with FDA for a small number of topics, one or two topics, at a time and get a quick turnaround with FDA so they could very quickly get the answers they need to move forward. So, as part of that PDUFA negotiation, FDA created the Type D meeting, which again is a much faster. It's restricted to one or two topics, but you get a fast turnaround with FDA, and again, you can get the answers you need to move forward. EMA, on the other hand, takes a more committee-based approach, if you like. They obviously have the CHMP committee, which has representatives from all of the member state agencies. And the CHMP has a process of scientific advice. The scientific advice can be on any topic again, but there's only really one meeting type. So you apply for scientific advice to EMA, and the CHMP will consider your submission, whether it's clinical, non-clinical, or otherwise, or a combination of topics. They will take that to the CHMP meeting. All of the member states will provide their input and advice. That will be collated and distilled, if you like, into a response on behalf of EMA, on behalf of the European nations for your program. So at the end of the day, you end up with a set of minutes from that meeting, and on both sides. The key difference is that typically in Europe, you won't meet with the regulators unless they see a need to meet with you to discuss more complex or difficult topics in your submission. So it's predominantly paper-based. With FDA, on the other hand, when you submit your meeting request, you can request the type of meeting you want to have, whether it's just written responses, whether it's via Zoom like we are today, or in person. They will assess that need against their schedule and the gravity of the topics you're discussing, and then they will assign you a meeting type. So they may assign you a virtual meeting, which is, since COVID has been probably the predominant meeting type and works quite effectively. On other cases, they may assign you a written responses only, where they will provide you a written response to your questions, and then you can move on from there. You can digest those responses and move on with your program or ask follow-up questions.
Thank you. Of those different meeting types, which are required, which are optional? What is the cost for each meeting type? And for the optional ones, how do you determine whether or not it makes sense for you to take advantage of that meeting?
Right. That's a big one. That's a big one. So the required meeting types, technically speaking, are the end of phase two, where you agree on your phase three or pivotal program with FDA, and the pre-NDA meeting, where you agree with them on the structure and the content, and you preview, if you like, with them the content of your NDA, so that you can agree ahead of time on any issues that you need to address before you're filing that application. More and more now, the end of phase one is becoming critical, if not required. So you would be hard pressed to get through an end of phase one into two without having a meeting with the FDA, and that's also because, particularly or in the oncology space, there is now a project called Project Optimus, which FDA has launched for oncology molecules to optimize the dosing. Both the dose level and the dosing strategy. And that typically is discussed and agreed at the end of phase one meeting. So at the end of each phase, if you like, you also have optional meetings being the pre-IND meeting before you submit your IND for your first in-human study. Again, they are recommended to have. I would say recommended because that is your opportunity to get a preview of FDA's expectations for your IND package and make sure that you have the opportunity before you submit to address any shortfall, any concerns they have, or make any changes, so that you're not under pressure when you file your IND to very quickly turn around answers for FDA. You can alleviate some of that upfront, and then during the whole cycle of your development, you have those Type C and Type D meetings. They are optional, and they can be triggered at any time by requesting a meeting, and they all have their own set timeframes for the time FDA will take between requesting the meeting to assign the meeting itself, and the time frame in between that where they expect you to file your briefing book. For example, the Type C is typically a 75-day time frame from filing the request to having the meeting, and then you'll have about 40 days, 45 days before the meeting, they will expect you to file your briefing book. The Type D, on the other hand, is much faster. It's a 30-day and 30-day, so a 60-day time frame, a bit faster turnaround. The cost for those meetings with FDA, they are free. They're covered by the PDUFA filing fees when you file your NDA. So FDA doesn't charge you for those. If we flip over to EMA, EMA publishes a calendar for scientific advice. So there are specific entry points and exit points based on the meeting schedule for the CHMP, the committee that considers all of these requests for advice. And so it's roughly monthly schedule. So you must submit by the deadline each month, and then you know what the set procedure will be, the number of days before you get your answer, or before you will receive a response, and then perhaps have a request for more information or for an oral hearing, or you will simply know that you're getting your response. Now, EMA, on the other hand, does charge, typically, unless you're an orphan drug or a small to medium enterprise. And I believe, off the top of my head, it is published on their site, but I believe it's in the realm of 70 to 80,000 euros per meeting, I think, and it's sort of scaled depending on how many topics and how many different subject matter experts you need, or areas you need to address. So it does cost money, but again, it's money invested in understanding the requirements of the agency, aligning with them to make sure you get the best outcome when you come to market or file your NDA or MAA to market your product.
Mhm. Now, we talked about different meeting types. We talked
Mhm.
about EMA, FDA. Um, is there a typical process that is consistent in terms of preparation across all these meetings, or are they very different in how you prepare?
But I would typically try, and in the teams that I lead, try to have a consistent process for preparation, in the sense that the first thing you want to understand is why do we want to have a meeting with the agency? What is our end goal? And what is the outcome of that meeting that we need? And so when we understand that, we need alignment, for instance, on the pivotal phase 3 study design. So that could be the goal, and we want alignment with FDA, let's say, on that design. So we're talking about an end of phase 2 type meeting. Then we want to make sure that we set out the timeline such that when we have to file that briefing book, we have enough information, enough data available to us to craft a persuasive argument as to why the design we put forward is the best design that we think we should be executing to deliver the data they need for approval. And so often we see companies perhaps try to have a meeting because it's a milestone and they want to have a meeting. And some of the pitfalls, they sometimes go too early. They don't have enough information for FDA to give an answer, or for FDA to give an answer, a solid answer. Sometimes FDA will say, we can't answer that for you now. Or if you don't have enough information, they can give you an answer that perhaps is not ideal for you or not favorable. So it's important to make sure you're going to the meeting with a clear purpose, and you're calling a meeting when you know you will have enough data to make your persuasive argument. Now, you're never going to have all the data you'd like to have available, but that's where the judgment call comes, and the regulatory professionals and the team at the company will have to make that judgment as to how much is enough to be persuasive enough to get the outcome you want from the agency. Then when you take a step back and think about the preparation, you want to craft your meeting request, in which you have to lay out the questions that you want to ask the agency. And in the request itself, you're required to just give a brief rationale for each of those questions. So it's not the full package, but just enough for the agency to look at it and understand what you're trying to achieve, what level of priority, if you like, or criticality that meeting has. And that then enables them to appropriately schedule their resources and decide what type of meeting you should be awarded. And once they award your meeting, then the briefing book work, you need to file a briefing book. So you'll be working on that, and that's where you really lay out your questions and give them all of your rationale for to persuade them that that is the best path for you to take for a given option, if you like. So, as an example, you might say, we believe that studying the safety and efficacy of this drug in this population is the best way to demonstrate that this drug is safe, effective, and of high quality. We believe that this design, randomized design, is the best design. We want to be uh, double-blinded, but we want to have used these inclusion and exclusion criteria. And you would lay that out and give your rationale and justification. And then you file that in your briefing book. Your FDA will consider it. They'll go to the meeting and you'll discuss through with them their perspective on that and your perspective, and you have the opportunity to negotiate with them on those pieces of information on those questions.
Mhm. You mentioned some of the mistakes and pitfalls that companies can fall into. Can you talk about maybe some of the other mistakes and pitfalls that exist, how companies can avoid them,
Mhm.
and if they were unable to avoid them, what are the consequences?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we talked about the going too early when you don't have enough information for FDA to give you a response at all, or you don't have enough information to convince them of your perspective or the outcome you desire, and so they give you a negative response, if you like. They say, no, we don't think you should do that because you have not proven to us that that is the right way to go. We need X, Y, Z data for you to show us that. And so that the consequence of that is that you get put back in time. It delays your program because you then have to go and get that data and make sure that you have refiled with FDA to convince them of that. Otherwise, the negative advice that you've gotten may push you in a direction that is more time consuming, more or less cost effective, if you like, for running your development program. Remembering that we are all trying to develop the most efficient clinical development program that we can to deliver the level of data at a high quality that will enable FDA to make a positive decision.
Yeah, and
Uh,
just to touch on that, you
yes.
talked about time, right? And in increased data.
Mhm.
Right? And you explain the consequence of that. Um, I just wanted to kind of underscore that the time requirement, the amount of data that's required to be collected, and the cost associated with that can be dramatic.
Yes.
And so I just wanted to pause the audience to say the consequences you're talking about reach a level of severity that'll probably take away some of your sleep.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And these things can, I mean, they can cost you. Sure, they could cost you between months, but they could cost you years of time. Without the right preparation. On the other side of the scale, if you like, is bombarding FDA with so much data that it just overwhelms them, and they're not able to decipher it in that right way. So again, you want your briefing book to be as concise as possible, no more, no less, if you like, it to be framed in the right way and written in the right way that is a persuasive argument with just the right amount of data to make that argument and to persuade FDA that that is the best way forward. And thinking about that also, when we go to FDA or EMA or any other agency, often the sponsor wants to make a proposal, and our proposal is this. And then, a conservative proposal would be here, and you end up somewhere in between. Sometimes you get exactly what you're looking for, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get somewhere in the middle. But you always, if you do it in that way, and you really are thoughtful, logical, and science-based in your arguments, with FDA, you can feel comfort that you always get the best possible outcome with the data you had on hand at that time. Again, not always the optimal outcome that you wanted, but the best one you could achieve. And that also is one of the key responsibilities of the regulatory professionals is to make sure they facilitate that conversation, that storytelling with FDA to make sure that you get that best outcome. And they will always accept a very conservative approach, but like you just said, the conservative approach takes far more resources, far more time, and that time takes away potentially, effective molecules, effective drugs from patients in need. So that's important to keep in mind.
Now, when I'm preparing for a meeting, how do I identify and prioritize the questions I'm going to bring?
Mhm. Yeah, so you really want to be up front before you file those questions. You want to think through carefully, again, with the end in mind, if this is the outcome we want agreement on the design of this study. We want to make sure we have a question on each of the critical elements of that study design. Make sure there's no ambiguity when we design that protocol, that we are clear that it is going to meet the needs and requirements of the agency. So you design your questions in that way, again, focused on making sure you hit all of the key elements that you need to be able to move forward and design your protocol and execute it in a way that will provide the data that's required. So in terms of a protocol, of course, you think about the overall study design, you think about the randomization, blinding, the study population, inclusion, exclusion, also the statistical designs, the sample size, how you arrived at the sample size, the endpoints you're using, the timing and the powering of those endpoints. All of those things all combine when you think about a pivotal study design. If you take it back to maybe a pre-IND meeting, you're thinking more about the GLP tox and safety studies that you've done in the non-clinical realm in the animal models, making sure that they are adequate to support the dosing that you're proposing in that first in human study. Make sure you've done or you have an understanding of the basics of the metabolism of your drug, at least in the preclinical space, so you can then preempt those any issues in the clinical space and modify your protocol accordingly. The other things you want to concern yourself with in the pre-IND space are things that might trigger a safety concern for FDA when they review your IND.
Yeah. And when we're talking about these regulatory agencies, that's exactly what they are. And so you're constantly being evaluated, almost like you're applying for a job. Even when you're not in the interview, any communication, you're being evaluated, right?
Yes.
And I would say the more you come across as not knowing what you're doing, the more concern is generated, and that can lead to some of the consequences that you were talking about. So, can you comment on the importance of team alignment when going into these meetings?
Yeah, that is critical. And it's the team alignment, team preparation, and understanding the role and responsibility of each person in that team in the meeting. And what we would do is we would prep ahead of time. So we have time, we've filed our briefing book, we know when the meeting is. So we would take all of those questions that we've provided to FDA, and we would then run some practice scenarios. A positive and a negative scenario, if you like. If FDA agrees with everything, great. Is there anything else we need to clarify? If FDA disagrees with this question, what would be our fallback position? If they disagree with part of it, if it's a sort of a multi-part, or there's a gray area, okay, how will we handle that? And we make sure we have as much practice and alignment amongst the team as to what those potential answers could be and who's going to answer them. The other thing I like to do when I'm in a meeting with the agency and preparing the team for that is to make sure that the people understand the role of the regulatory professional is really to facilitate and MC the meeting. It's a much better outcome if you can get the subject matter experts at FDA discussing with the subject matter experts at the company, then and allow the regulatory professionals to facilitate that conversation and guide it, make sure that we're getting the right outcomes or the right information, clarity on those outcomes, rather than simply having the regulatory person take all of the questions, answer all the questions, and sort of a game of telephone, if you like, because often that's where you get the best outcome is, statisticians, for instance. Get your statistician to speak to the FDA statistician on that meeting. They can sort of run through the more technical aspects, and then the regulatory professional will make sure that we have clarity on the outcome. It's minuted, and any clarifying questions, and we move forward on to the next topic. So again, that's critically important for each person to understand their role and maximize the benefit of that role within the meeting context.
Now, in this meeting, we're going to present to FDA, have conversations. We know what type of outcomes we want, and there's going to be some back and forth.
Mm.
Um, in these meetings, you will hear things that you disagree with, that you want to negotiate. Um, what is your advice on how to handle those types of moments?
Yeah. So I find the best way is to really listen and understand what's being said, what FDA's position is, and you can ask for clarification on those points. If they're saying, well, no, we think this, typically they will explain it to you, but if they don't, then ask for that explanation. Can you help us to understand better your perspective on X, Y, and Z? Really understanding, because if there is always something underlying their position, and they do have a responsibility to explain that for you, and typically they will. And so when they explain that, then there is most often an opportunity to find some middle ground. You can suggest things. It doesn't have to be a yes/no battle. It's okay. We don't think you should do your study in this way, because of these reasons. And you think, okay, well, what if we mitigated, reason A and B in this way? Coming up and some of it takes a little bit of on-the-spot thinking, but hopefully you've run through some of those scenarios also in your preparation. The other important thing to remember here also is that, and it works a little better in the online context, is that it's okay to mute the line and discuss amongst the team. And FDA will do that to you also. Sometimes you
They
make a
like to do
proposal,
that.
exactly, and they will say we need to mute the line and align because
Hmm.
they're like you and I.
Yeah.
They need team alignment to be able to come forward with a position, and they're okay if we do that also. And then you can discuss amongst the team. Okay, this is an issue. Maybe we could suggest X. Are we okay with that? Right. And we come back online and suggest it. I've seen that work numerous times. I think it's more important the way you engage with them as professionals, and a scientific, a logical basis, and do it in a professional way. And I know it sounds simple, but it's worth repeating. You know, engaging with them as a partnership for drug development. Really, that's what it is at the end of the day. They have a certain set of needs they have to meet. The company has a certain set of needs we have to meet, and we have to find a path forward with them. And there is always a path. It might, as I said earlier, it might not be your optimal path, but there is always a path forward, for 99% of cases.
Mm.
In the 1%, you might need to take a step back and see see what's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
And you use the word partnership.
Mm.
So I'm thinking about, we're getting to the conclusion of these meetings. How do we make sure that we're getting the appropriate feedback that we can act on? And, how do we ensure that once we get that, that we're implementing those steps adequately?
Mhm. Yeah, what I'm seeing more often these days, and these days I mean sort of in the COVID to post-COVID era, is that FDA are writing the minutes for that meeting during the meeting itself. The project manager will be writing the minutes. It used to be that you'd have the meeting and then the company would submit their version of the minutes, FDA would create theirs, and then they'd sort of you'd negotiate over the content. Now that happens live essentially. And so again, the role particularly for the regulatory affairs professional is to make sure that the critical pieces are minuted. And so whether I've been in some meetings where the meeting minutes are projected, and so you can see literally what's being written in the meeting minutes at that time. Some other groups within FDA do it, sort of behind the scene, if you like, but it's still there, and you can feel free to highlight. Can we make sure that this is minuted, this outcome, this decision, and they will negotiate that. Typically, you're minuting something that you've agreed upon, or a critical factor that both sides have just discussed, and so you want to make sure that that is minuted there. And then if you think about when you receive the minutes later on, there is an opportunity to correct things, although I've also had varied experience in that regard, since when you get to the end of the meeting, typically they will run through the key aspects of the minutes with you, and then that's your chance to agree and make changes. But if there is something that is particularly wrong when the minutes come out, people make mistakes, you do have that mechanism by which you can work with your project manager to have the minutes corrected.
Mhm. So in this conversation, we're starting to transition toward the end of the meeting,
Hmm.
right? So let's talk about what happens once it's done.
Hmm.
Okay. So, we've gotten the meeting minutes. There's probably some open-ended points of discussion.
Hmm.
What does post-meeting look like?
Yeah, yeah. So typically, acutely, post-meeting at the company, you would have a debrief, make sure everybody's aligned around what they heard, what the meeting outcomes mean, and what the next steps are, if any immediate next steps. Sometimes that could be providing additional data for FDA. So I have had experience where FDA said we can't make a decision on this right now on this particular question, but we discussed and presented in real time some additional data that we had that had come sort of late in the game, and they said, okay, can you give that to us afterwards? Make a submission afterwards, and then we will add it to the minutes and our decision based on that. So there's an opportunity still. So you get that data to them, and they can add that to the minutes. The other piece for the company is to make sure we have a clear plan of how to implement, like you said, how to implement what FDA has recommended. And so we need that, and we need to very quickly consider whether there are any follow-up clarifications. Is there anything that we're not clear about from these meeting minutes and from the outcome of this meeting? And if there are, you have that opportunity to go back and clarify with your project manager in an informal way in that sense as a follow-up to that meeting. Additionally, you have other mechanisms. I mean, if you get a few months down the track and you realize, oh, actually, this is going to be a challenge for us, you can have another engagement with FDA. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal, full meeting engagement, but there are other mechanisms, whether it's a Type D meeting or there's even a written request for advice that you can file in your IND. I believe it's section 113. And so you file your questions, brief questions with FDA, and they will give you a response. So there's multiple mechanisms by which you can follow up and make sure you're clear on what needs to happen next.
Great. So what has been your experience in attending these meetings as of late? Are you seeing any trending? Are you seeing any changes? And if you could kind of provide the audience with things that they can expect as we go into 2025,
Mhm.
how would you answer that question?
Yeah, in terms of trends, I think, as I think it was last year, FDA started to open up more, for instance, to face-to-face meetings. I haven't been to one since pre-COVID, but I've had several meetings, multiple meetings in this online format. And my own personal sort of perspective is that it can be a lot easier to coordinate the Zoom meetings. And if you're in video, you still get that sort of facial expression, interpretation with all the agency representatives. It's not quite as effective, I think, as a face-to-face meeting, but it's a lot easier to schedule because I believe FDA is just, the meeting request numbers, the sheer number of meeting requests is only going up for FDA, and they have, finite resources. So I think that's one trend I'm seeing, and the other trend is that I think because of that, they're being more judicious about allocating meetings versus written responses. As I understand it from industry forums and other sources, that uh, a lot of the Type D meetings these days are still being given as written responses only. So, I think hopefully we'll see a bit more of a trend in that direction towards Type D meetings being short conversations rather than simply written responses. I think that's the more valuable format. But again, resource-wise, that can be challenging. And obviously, resourcing with FDA there's always a political component to that. Their funding needs to be, approved by Congress, and there can always be challenges to that, so they need to manage their resources effectively. I'm hoping that we can at least continue to see that growth in their resources over time, but you never know. So we have to maximize what we can get from FDA at any given time, but also be judicious ourselves about our engagements and the purpose of our engagements with FDA.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Let's say I'm working with meeting with FDA, meeting with EMA.
Mhm.
I'm getting feedback from both agencies. How do I harmonize that type of
Mhm.
feedback? How do I, put that into a, understandable and digestible thing?
Yes. Yeah, there are a few options. One option it's available, although I'm not sure it's been used as frequently or to maximize the value of that, is to have joint scientific advice from FDA and EMA. That is a pathway that is available. Um, Personally, I've never tried that. I've heard it can be cumbersome and challenging.
Mm.
to execute effectively. But that is one aspect. What I have done effectively is to stagger your engagements, but typically most industry would go to FDA just by virtue of development programs and availability of meetings and resources. Uh, and what we've done is we've gone to FDA with our proposal, taken FDA's feedback, modified as necessary, and then taken that proposal to EMA. And what we did, a couple of key points. One, EMA does offer a preliminary advice mechanism, and so it's a little bit different to the way FDA works in that EMA themselves, of course, CHMP is representatives of the member state regulatory agencies, and they make the final determination on the advice you get back on your meeting package. But there are folks working at EMA who coordinate all of those activities, and they can give you some scientific perspective, scientific advice on what they think will be key factors for CHMP. So it's kind of a preliminary advice. It's not binding, but I've been through that a couple of times now, and it's been quite helpful for us to sort of modify and evolve our meeting package to get the best outcome from CHMP. So that's one element. It takes a little more time, but it's worthwhile in my mind to take that path. The other piece that came from that is EMA recognized that most often companies have been to FDA first. And so what we did was we actually sent the FDA minutes along as part of our EMA package because they recognize we try to harmonize as much as possible. It doesn't help drug development. It doesn't help patients if we are completely divergent in our advice. It doesn't mean they'll always agree, but at least they have a perspective and they know where FDA is coming from on a particular program. And additionally, let's not forget they talk to each other all the time as well. The different divisions talk to each other, therapeutic areas, and they understand what everybody's working on. Because most big molecules from pharma are being rolled out almost simultaneously. So there's an opportunity there though to stagger. So FDA first, perhaps get that advice, take that to EMA, include your minutes in there if you feel comfortable, and certainly it's valuable, I think. They'll try and harmonize as much as possible, and then you just have to figure out the mix and see where the Venn diagram sits between the two pieces of advice. And then it can be some challenging internal conversations to see how you want to prioritize the development programs if they really are divergent, and look for the opportunities to meet both needs, and then perhaps one or the other gets pushed out in a staggered fashion anyway, because they don't always agree 100%.
Mhm. Excellent. So, what advice would you give to startups, biotechs, organizations that are preparing for their first interaction with FDA, EMA? What type of advice would you give?
I would go back to the partnership discussion. I mean, you have the agency, folks at FDA, folks at EMA, they get up in the morning, they brush their teeth, they go to work. They're predominantly scientists, physician scientists or otherwise, and they have a set of criteria that they need to meet to fulfill their obligation and their responsibility to the constituents they represent. And so treat it as a partnership that everybody's trying to get new medicines to patients ultimately, and we have to figure out a way to satisfy their needs and the company's needs. And also treat it as an opportunity because if whilst you can't simply, well, I wouldn't advise simply going in and asking open-ended questions or what should I do about this? Go in with a position, but treat that as also an opportunity to negotiate that position
Hmm.
and take the advice you can get. And even when FDA says no, you get your response from FDA and it says no to this question. It never just says no. It says no, and this is why we're saying no. This is what you would need to show, or otherwise. And that can be the gold because that really teaches you what you need to provide. And so every engagement is an opportunity to build the rapport with the agency, to build the reputation of your organization, and to build that sort of partnership in developing your molecule right from the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. One thing I would add is if you're preparing, and you don't have anybody in the company that's done this before, you should reach out to a consulting firm. Obviously, at the FDA group, we help with that. There are other companies that can help as well. But you don't want to try to do this on your own. The first time, the consequences, as we've discussed earlier, can be pretty dramatic. So I would add that little tidbit because it's the truth. Um, so, I mean, this was excellent. Very concise, very easy to understand. Excellent job. What would you like to leave the audience with?
I would say, most importantly, understand your end goal and craft your questions to hit that end goal and treat this like an opportunity to partner with the agency and understand mutual understanding on both sides of how to get your development program forward so you can ultimately bring new medicines to patients.
Mhm. Excellent. Ashley, thank you very much. I really appreciate the insight. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you have not already, subscribe to get new updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA group on LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.